All right, hey, let's dive in. As we look at evolution and the change over time that brings about not only new traits and new characteristics and new adaptations, but entirely new species. The one and the biggest thing we have to remember with that is that this all takes time, and not time as in it needs a few years, it needs a few generations, but time that is tough for us as humans with 80-year-old lifespans. A time scale is tough for us to understand. So we're gonna take a look at that today, and just understanding like the history of life on Earth and how all that massive amount of time is going to help lead to some of those changes that we see currently with our species today. So as we look at it, 4.6 billion years ago, that is the accepted formation of our solar system and by extension Earth. Now, this isn't a picture of there, no humans were around to take a photo of it, but it would have been very molten, it would have been very hot still. It wouldn't have been ideal conditions for life to begin or to evolve in. But it does bring the question if, hey, if no one was there to write it down, if no one was there to see it, how do we know that this is something that actually happened? So, how do we know it was 4.6 billion years ago? Well, thanks to a very famous Iowan, and as an Iowan myself, I always like to throw that trivia fact in there. But it would be Claire Cameron Peterson was the one who put together that puzzle for us. And he did so by studying the radioactive decay of uranium. And now we're going to be looking at radioactive decay and how isotopes change over time and how we can measure that as kind of an atomic clock and work those times backwards. But for now, let's just talk about that as the idea of studying the radioactive decay of uranium, which takes billions of years. He was able to look at samples of asteroids and meteorites and things from space that have been roaming around the solar system, pretty much untouched since its beginning, and determined that every single meteorite and asteroid he looked at came back with that 4.5 billion years number, giving us some pretty good evidence that, hey, that's when these things were formed and started rolling around there. And so we can deduce that the Earth was also roughly around that time. But once again, it took a while. All right, it took a while for life to make an appearance. The first life in the fossil record, and I say the fossil record kind of loosely because if we work our mutation models backwards, we get this single cellular life showing up around 3.6 billion years ago. Okay, that's a long time. It's also, those are very small cells and small organisms. So we don't have the fossils like we do with dinosaurs, but looking at those biological clocks and working them backwards, somewhere around this time is when we start to see those organic components forming. So we look at almost a billion years after the formation of the Earth is when we start to see some life taking place. 2 point, or not 2.0, 2.0 billion years ago. Another big step in that evolution as we look at the changes is we see our first eukaryotic organisms show up. A very fascinating theory called the endosymbiosis theory about how we did get organelles inside of cells like we have today. That's for maybe a different level of biology class. But on the records and our data points to about 2 billion years ago, eukaryotic organisms started showing up. So a billion years of no life, a billion and a half years of just single-celled bacteria, archaea kind of things. And then after that, we see eukaryotic organisms show up. Another billion years passes. There's a lot of time, and we see our first multicellular life. So life developed the ability to exist as more than one cell. Okay, this is really when evolution started just burst onto the scene and started taking place because now organisms had more than one cell to build with. So they had new features that they could size and all different kinds of things that they could start to play with for an adaptation side of things. So a billion years ago, we see our first multicellular life, and life as we know it really exploded at that point into a huge amount of diversity. We always like to think about the vertebrates or those the forms of life that are more similar to us. So 500 million years ago, our scale changed. We see our first fish species start to appear. And these we do have fossils of. And so roughly 500 million years ago, the first fish as vertebrates start to evolve. This one here is a placoderm. That was the size of like a small school bus. It had like an armor-plated head and roamed the oceans there. Another 75 million, or not 75, another 25 million years passes, and we see our first land plants start to appear. These are the same plants that would decay and would not have the organisms that could break them down yet. And so these are the plants that we burn today as fossil fuels, as those land plants died off and kind of decomposed underneath the Earth's crust. Another 100-ish million years passes, and we see our first amphibians showing up on the fossil record. This is Tiktaalik, which would be the first, amphibians were the first vertebrates to have roamed onto land. And so really a huge benchmark in evolution, and one especially we as humans pay close attention to. And that's 360 million years ago. Early amphibians like the one seen on the picture start to develop. We've seen fossils of these things that had the ability and the shoulders to walk on land, but also swim in the water. And then once life um, found land and had its resources available to it, that's where we start seeing a lot more species we're familiar with. So 200 million years ago, reptiles appear on the scene. Think about them as amphibians, but they've broken the chain of having to stay on the water. They can lay eggs, they can have scales, so they're waterproof. It also led to the development of claws and teeth and all of these exciting adaptations that we study. So 200 million years ago, the early dinosaurs start to show up. 150 million years ago, the precursor for birds shows up on the scene. So this is Archaeopteryx, and we found a fossil of this one. And it would be a dinosaur with wings. And you could see on the fossil, they had the feathers and the wings underneath. It was probably more of a glider, so it wasn't, flapping its wings like an eagle and taking off, but it would glide around different heights. And so the early precursor to birds show up at the same time here with the dinosaurs. 65 million years ago. So once again, our time scale is getting smaller and smaller as we get closer to today. The first mammals start to show up. Now, coincidentally, 65 million years ago was also the asteroid impact that wiped out the dinosaurs happened. And so early mammals with hair and live birth and mammary glands started showing up on the scene, and they were mainly nocturnal and mainly underground. So they were able to survive in the age of the dinosaurs, and also when the Earth was a dangerous place from a atmospheric standpoint with asteroid collisions and those kind of things. Species that lived underground had a better survival rate. Those would eventually change over time and have ancestors and evolve into 15 million years ago. We see the first evidence of the apes, right? So primates that are tailless and have larger brains and more chromosomes, those kind of things. And then anywhere, and this is tough. It's tough to pick out like an exact point where, hey, there's a Homo sapien, there's a human skeleton. But as we look at it, it's anywhere between 1 million to 200,000 years ago is when those early Homo sapiens skeletons showed up. I included the 200,000 years ago mark because that's the most recent. All the models are in agreement that, like, yeah, 200,000 years ago, human beings existed. But then, like, how far back was that, a human versus something else there? So there's just kind of a brief look at the timeline of life on Earth, looking at a few select different groups of species. It helps gives us a feel for just how old the Earth is and how long species have existed on Earth and their genetics have been changing. It wasn't like, hey, a couple thousand years and we go from a single-celled organism to a human being. Try a couple billion years, and a couple billion years is just a time frame that we as humans we can't comprehend with our shortened lifespans. So there's a look at the history of life on Earth. Next up, we'll continue to look at evolution and looking at examples of, not necessarily examples, but pieces of evidence as to how we're able to build this puzzle as to where we came from. So thanks for tuning in.